Hello everyone, Andrew here, and welcome to another video about Nintendo's portable consoles. Not too long ago we talked about the original Game Boy, the Game Boy Pocket, and the Game Boy Color, so it makes sense to now move on to talking about the Game Boy Advance, which was released in 2001, so that's 3 years after the Game Boy Color was released. In 1998, and the Game Boy Advance compared to the Game Boy Color, if you turn the Game Boy Color horizontally, they're actually just about the same size. Although it is interesting to note that, unlike the Game Boy Color and all of the other kind of Game Boy variations, the buttons have been moved to the side rather than being underneath the screen, and your screen is actually also a little bit wider now. Also, unlike the Game Boy Color and all those other variations, you now have L and R buttons, which is pretty cool, although the screen at this point was not backlit. What we're actually going to be doing in this video is looking at the Game Boy Advance and all of its kind of crazy variations, including the Game Boy Advance SP and the Game Boy Micro. We're going to be looking at all the different kind of color variants that I have, and some of the accessories that I have for it. This video is definitely not going to cover every single variation, because there are just so many variations of the Game Boy Advance in terms of color and different designs. Just like how the original kind of Game Boy started, but now I find that it's even kind of a larger scale now. It was just like how we have with the 3DS today, where it seems like every single game almost gets its own kind of variant or special edition. Like you have Zelda ones, Pikachu editions, all that kind of crazy stuff. The Game Boy Advance had a lot of that as well. It had Zelda editions, it had, NES themed ones, and there are just so many kind of crazy ones that unless you had like $1 bajillion to spend on every single one that comes out, it's very, very, very difficult to collect them all. But we're going to try to go over as many as I can in this video, at least all of the ones that I own. And yeah, hopefully you enjoy seeing Nintendo's 32-bit, which it always made sure to point it on the box, portable handheld, which was a really, 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 really cool kind of upgrade from the Game Boy Color to the Game Boy Advance. I mean, just you had a whole bunch of like ports of Super Nintendo games. It was super, super cool. Plus, it was backwards compatible with all of your original Game Boy and Game Boy Color games, which was awesome. Before we delve too much into the console, since we're speaking about games anyway, let's just take a quick look at the design of Game Boy Advance games and their kind of outside packaging. Game Boy Advance games have boxes which are exactly the same size as original Game Boy and Game Boy Color games, although their cartridges are much different, where you have your original Game Boy cartridge and your much slimmer Game Boy Advance cartridges. People have probably seen these a million times, but just for the sake of being complete, we'll zoom in on them anyway. Original, very square in shape, has that little notch at the top over here, which was actually something for the original Game Boy that would kind of come across that you couldn't play your game out while the machine was on. And then you have the much thinner Game Boy Advance cartridges with these little notches on the side, which would prevent them from, which would prevent you from putting them into your Game Boy Color or any kind of Game Boy that was, previous to the Game Boy Advance, and then they would potentially get stuck in there. I've always wondered what would happen if you cut those notches off and put them into a Game Boy Color or, a Game Boy Pocket. Would you get like an error message, or would it just not work, or, would they explode? Something crazy would probably happen, but I've never had the guts to cut them off myself. So if anyone out there has done that, I'd love to hear what the heck exactly happens. One last thing to note about the Game Boy Advance box, since I always love to compare between regions, is that in Japan, the Game Boy Advance box design was very different. It was much narrow. It fit the kind of theme of the cartridges much better. How the original Game Boy games were square in design, so their boxes were square. The Game Boy Advance cartridges were very kind of narrow, so their boxes were more narrow. And I think that looks super cool in comparison. I mean, instead of just having Game Boy Advance boxes, which are the exact same square shape as the original games were. But yeah, I always thought that was kind of a cool difference, and this is, of course, Phoenix Wright 3, which was never released on the Game Boy Advance in North America, but it's better on the DS anyway, so you're not missing out too much by not having played it on the Game Boy Advance. But yeah, that's pretty much all there is to say about the cartridges. Of course, the graphical capabilities and all that kind of stuff are way better on the Game Boy Advance than they were on the original Game Boy and all that, despite the fact that the cartridge is smaller. That's cool and just, shows technological advancement at its best. But with that, I think we're going to jump back to the console now, and we're going to talk about all the different colors and variations that I own of the original one at this point. So this is the Glacier model, which is the one that I actually had growing up. I always really liked consoles that had kind of that kind of clear plastic where you could kind of see the circuits and stuff inside. You know, the original Game Boy had some of those as well. The Nintendo 64 was great, having the Fantastic series of that, although it's definitely not something that you see very often these days. Usually consoles are just like a solid color, usually gray. You unfortunately don't get kind of those, you know, fun, clear colors anymore. So that is the Glacier Blue one. Another very common color of the Game Boy Advance was the purple, just kind of solid indigo. Actually, yeah, do they call it indigo? Yeah, they call it indigo. I always call it purple. Same with the GameCube. It was also, you know, indigo, although I always just called it purple. Then you had the white version, which I remember seeing, like, I think Nintendo Power featured the white Game Boy Advance on the front, and it was used in a few advertisements and things. Then you had the Platinum version. Platinum was always a cool color, and you know, even going back to like the Game Boy Pocket had a Platinum version. The Nintendo GameCube had a Platinum version, which was pretty cool. Then you have the clear pink version, and we have a few exclusive versions here. We have the blue Toys R Us exclusive model, which is very cool. I've always really liked, you know, blue consoles. If you watched my my kind of Game Boy cabinet overview video, you probably noticed that my entire like Nintendo DS shelf is blue. I have like the blue Nintendo DS Lite, the blue Nintendo DSi, the blue Nintendo 3DS, the blue Nintendo 3DS XL. I've always loved blue consoles. So this unfortunately wasn't the color that I was able to get my hands on back in the day, because it was Toys R Us exclusive, and I kind of am not really a huge fan of exclusive things, like, you know, like this amiibo is going to be exclusive to this store, and it's like, that's just a huge pain. I like it when things are available everywhere. So that's why I wasn't able to get my hands on a blue Game Boy Advance back in the day, but still, it's definitely a cool thing to own complete in the box these days. Also, we have the red Game Boy Advance. Now, this was actually exclusive to Target in the United States and to Zellers in Canada. Zellers was kind of like Target in Canada, Zellers in Canada was kind of like what Target is in the United States, kind of a, you know, that big box store, a competitor to Walmart. But they closed down not too long ago, and that's where I actually got a lot of these shelves that you see in the background from. So they will be missed, but it is cool, you know, that I was able to get their shelves, and this is the Game Boy Advance that was exclusive to them. You can tell the difference because I believe that the red Game Boy Advance that was exclusive to Target actually has Target's name along the top, but the one, the red Game Boy Advance that was exclusive to Zellers, it wouldn't have made any sense for it to say Target, and I guess they didn't bother putting the Zellers name on it. So it is just a red Game Boy Advance. I think it looks better than, you know, having the name Target on it. It's like, I'm not a walking advertisement. I just want a red Game Boy Advance, and I shouldn't have to tell everybody where I bought it from. So those are the models, or the different colors that I own of the original Game Boy Advance. There are definitely a few other ones out there. There was even an Orange Spice one released in Japan, just like how we have the Orange Spice GameCube controllers here, and how there was also an Orange Spice actually console, GameCube console in Japan. There was also an Orange Spice Game Boy Advance that was released in Japan. I'm not sure what they, I guess they were obviously a much bigger fan of Orange than we are here in North America. I'm not really a big Orange console fan, so I mean, I guess it didn't bother me too much. I've always been all about the blue, as I've said. But that's another one that was released in Japan, and there were a few other ones as well. Like, I believe a black one. But I don't have them all, but I do have kind of a nice selection here. So hopefully you enjoyed having a look at that. But after the original Game Boy Advance was released in 2001, 2 years later, in 2003, Nintendo came out with the Game Boy Advance SP, which was a very, very, very cool improvement over the original Game Boy Advance, because it features a lit screen. Now, not necessarily backlit, we're going to get into that. The original Game Boy Advance SP actually had a front-lit screen, but it was super cool because it was nice and compact. You could just fold it up, fit it into your pocket. Although, interestingly, the buttons now are once again below the screen rather than at the sides. This again played both your original Game Boy and Game Boy Color games, along with all Game Boy Advance games, of course. But one of the other, aside from being lit, the screen being lit, one of the biggest features that I kind of, noticed when it came out, and of course, it still exists despite the fact that it didn't just come out, is the fact that the Game Boy Advance SP was the first Nintendo portable console to not take batteries, and it would now plug into the wall, with this wall charger. When I was a kid, I would never leave the house without 2 spare AA batteries in case I was in the middle of playing Pokemon or whatever, at a relative's house, and the last thing you wanted to do was your Game Boy to die like 5 minutes after showing up at the relative's house and having nothing to do because, your grandparents didn't have, an NES or something like that. Maybe some people's did. That would be really cool, but mine didn't, unfortunately. I remember once they finally got the internet. That was pretty cool because I didn't have a computer for the longest time, so I'd always go over to their house and use the internet. But if you were somewhere and your Game Boy died, you could just pop in new 2 AA batteries and you would be good to go. One problem that I did kind of have with the SP, because I was so used to having that ability to just pop in 2 new AA batteries, was that if it died somewhere, you had to have a wall outlet and then like 3 hours to charge it. Otherwise, you were out of luck and couldn't keep playing your game. So that was one thing that I actually, even today, I guess, still am not a huge fan of in regards to having to charge things. Plus, you always hear those horror stories about, oh no, if you don't let it charge the full 3 hours, and you unplug it early, it's going to wreck the battery life for future use. So that always worries me too. So I do kind of sometimes still miss that ability to just pop in new 2 AA batteries wherever I am and just, keep on playing. But that is an interesting thing to point out about the Game Boy Advance SP, was that it was the first Nintendo thing to actually charge with a cord and not, consume billions of batteries. The Game Boy Advance and Game Boy Color and the original Game Boy weren't that bad. Other than, the original Game Boy consumed 4 AA batteries. After that, it was always 2. It wasn't like the Virtual Boy or anything like that, which used 6 AA batteries and ate them up in like 2 hours. So I never really minded having to go through AA batteries, but it was kind of neat still, I guess, to be able to charge it and not have to, buy AA batteries every day. But let's go through some of the different colors that the Game Boy Advance SP came out in, as I was just showing the box here. A very nice, sleek, cool design, which makes it very clear that the screen is now lit up. So the worm light is now useless, but it's still neat. I still use my worm light on the original Game Boy Advance for years, and it got the job done, because I never actually owned a Game Boy Advance SP as a kid. I had the original Game Boy Advance, and then I jumped right to the Nintendo DS, which we'll talk a little bit about in a minute. But here we have the original black model. Here we have silver model. Again, silver, always a very popular color for Nintendo's portable consoles, although actually I don't think there's been... Oh yeah, there's the original DS was of course silver, and I don't think we've seen a silver portable Nintendo console since. I don't think there's like a silver 3DS or anything like that. Then we have red. We have blue. I've always really liked this one. Makes sense, have a nice blue Nintendo, as I almost said DS. Game Boy Advance SP when playing Mega Man Battle Network. And then we have some of the later models, which I'm going to explain. We have the bright gray one here, or not the bright gray, but if you compare it to the black one I mentioned earlier, you'll see it's a little bit lighter. So, it's not necessarily bright gray, but it's gray. And the light blue one. So what needs to be noted about the gray and blue one that I showed is that they are actually later models of the Game Boy Advance SP that were released in 2005. So this is actually after the Nintendo DS was released in 2004. And the difference between them and the other models that I showed is that these ones have a backlit screen and these ones have a frontlit screen, and the difference is incredible. I will actually show you right now just how you can tell. So 2005 model, 2003 model. I'm going to come right up here. If you look at the bottom of your Game Boy Advance SP, you'll notice that the code, hopefully it will zoom in, you might be able to see it a little bit, it says AGS001. That's the model number. There, I think you can see that a little bit there. That means that this is one of the early models with the frontlit screen released around 2003-2004. Here, it says model number AGS101, and that means that it is one of the backlit versions released later on. The backlit ones are very much more kind of sought after, but they're also much more harder to find because of how late they were released, because the screen is just way better. Let's see if I can get us a good demonstration here. So, that is the earlier model. On this model, when you press the button, it turns the backlight off and on. On the later models, the AGS101, let's turn this one on. You can, I was worried that maybe the difference wouldn't show up on the screen, but I think it does. This one, when you press the button, it doesn't turn the backlight off, but it will switch between a lower setting and a brighter setting. So yeah, so that wasn't even, you know, the brightest one. So even the lower brightness of the newer model is actually brighter than the frontlit screen of the earlier model. And then if we press that and make it super bright, yeah, so it's funny that you can actually even tell that on the screen. The backlit model is definitely the one you want to go after if you're looking for a Game Boy Advance SP to actually play, because it is 10 times easier to see the game on this screen than it is on the frontlit one. It's obviously really, 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 really cool. But just something interesting to note, because I think that a lot of people probably don't know about that. I remember for the longest time I actually didn't know that either. It wasn't until I picked one of these up and I said, hey, the brightness is completely different. And then yeah, I figured that out. So definitely keep your eye out on that code on the back. For the AGS101 is the one with the brighter screen that was released later and is harder to find, and it came in gray, blue, and I believe pink. Then you have colors like the darker blue and the red and black and silver and some other ones as well. Like, there were a ton of versions of the Game Boy Advance SP, which is why I'm saying I obviously can't have them all here. Like, there was an NES themed one that looked like an NES controller. There was a gold Legend of Zelda one. It seemed like everything had a gold Legend of Zelda version. Even today, you know, the 3DS still has one. There was like a Famicom version. There was a Mega Man Battle Network version only released in Japan. Like, there were just tons and tons and tons and tons of different variants of the SP. But it's definitely a good thing to know if you're hunting for one about that whole screen brightness thing. So keep an eye out for that. Because it's something I wish people would have told me back then too. Is it's just not always the most common knowledge, I suppose. But the final version of the Game Boy Advance we're going to be looking at is the Game Boy Micro. Now, it's funny because the Game Boy Micro box, you know, speaking of box differences between regions, this one is quite different between North America and Japan. Again, that nice kind of sleek, thinner box design, and then North America is gigantic, massive, clunky box design, despite the fact that they are, you know, the exact same console. The Game Boy Micro is very, 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 very small, and it's actually really cool because it featured a removable faceplate, which, as you can see here, it included a few different ones. And there might have been ways to get a couple other ones as well. That's not a feature that would come back, I think, until now the new 3DS, where you can swap kind of the picture that's on the top, the back of the top screen, which is pretty cool. But yeah, as you can see, we have the flame one here. Let's actually do a quick comparison to some of the different ones. So as you can see, Game Boy Micro definitely smaller than the Game Boy Advance SP, and definitely smaller than the original Game Boy Advance. The Game Boy Micro is not compatible with Game Boy and Game Boy Color games, so it only plays Game Boy Advance games, which is different from the Game Boy Advance SP and the original Game Boy Advance. Plus, it does not actually have a port for your link cable. But there actually was an accessory that did work with it though, but just not, you know, the typical Game Boy Advance link cable, which we're going to talk about in just a minute. This also had a backlit screen, which is pretty cool, and the screen, because it is actually smaller, you know, it's not just the console that's smaller, the screen actually is smaller too. Games look super, 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 super crisp on it, which is really neat. Although, again, you know, if you don't have the best eyesight, the screen is pretty small. Like, it feels so weird playing Mega Man Battle Network on this thing. It's just, you don't even know. But that is a pretty cool thing, too, the Game Boy Micro. And it also came with, you know, a carrying pouch, which is pretty cool, too. But yeah, I mean, there's only really one kind of color of this, because, of course, you could just change the face plates. But Game Boy Micro, again, also released in 2005, just like the later versions of the Game Boy Advance SP. And the Nintendo DS came out in 2004, so that's why, again, not just because, you know, they came out so late, but because the Nintendo DS was already out, most people were buying that, and I thought that too when I was a kid. Because I'm like, why would anybody want the Game Boy Micro when you could get the Nintendo DS, which also plays Game Boy Advance games? It didn't really make sense to me, but still. I mean, I would never have the guts to just, you know, put this in my pocket and it would, you know, who knows, fly out and go who knows where. But it is obviously very convenient for carrying it around and playing it wherever you go. It's definitely a neat thing to have in anyone's collection. With that said, though, that is all of the variants of the original Game Boy Advance, the Game Boy Advance SP, and the Game Boy Micro that I own. But just like with my original Game Boy video, we're not going to stop there. We're going to take a quick look at some of the accessories that were released for the Game Boy Advance. Mostly the main ones. There were a lot of third-party accessories for the GBA, but we're going to look at mostly the official ones, just like we did with the other Game Boys. And the first thing we're going to start off with, just like we did with them, is the link cable, which of course lets you play multiplayer games on the Game Boy Advance with your friends. One really cool thing about the Game Boy Advance, and I believe I'm definitely correct about this, is that there were some games where you didn't have to both own the game in order to play multiplayer. Unlike with the original Game Boy, where I believe you both always had to have the game, there were some Game Boy Advance games where as long as one person owned it, I believe you could still play two-player. Or am I getting that mixed up with the Nintendo DS, which definitely had download play? I might be doing that. But no, I could swear that you could do that with like the Mario Brothers game that was packaged in with like all of the Mario Advance games. I haven't played multiplayer. Anything other than Mega Man Battle Network multiplayer on the Game Boy Advance in a very long time. The point is, though, that the Game Boy Advance link cable features a few differences compared to the original Game Boy link cable. Mainly, you have a first player's port and the second player port, which would sometimes be important depending on the game that you were playing. Someone would have to be first player and someone would have to be second player. Another cool thing about the Game Boy Advance link cable is that all of them featured this little piece in the middle, which would allow you to plug another Game Boy Advance link cable into it, which would then, give you this plus a third end, and then you could plug another Game Boy Advance link cable into that to make it 4 ends. This would be opposed to kind of the 4-player adapter that you had to buy separately for the original Game Boy link cable, since now it's kind of a built-in feature, which is pretty cool. One thing, though, is that the Game Boy Advance link cable is still not very long, and I mean, I just hate, having to be right up in the other person's face while you're destroying them at Mega Man Battle Network. But that's why there are ones like this third-party one right here, which are way longer. Over twice as long. So if you're going to get a Game Boy Advance link cable, you might as well look for one of the third-party ones, which are like 10 times better. And I mean, they both work exactly the same. The third-party one even has that little bit in the middle, so you can plug another link cable into that. So if you're going to buy, Game Boy Advance link cable, definitely go third-party, despite the fact that the first-party one looks pretty cool, but it's just too darn short, in my opinion. So again, Game Boy Advance link cable, definitely one of the biggest staples in the system to be able to play multiplayer with your friends. Another way to play multiplayer with your friends, though, was through the Game Boy Advance wireless adapter. Now, this was released very kind of near the end of the Game Boy Advance lifetime. It was included with Pokemon Fire Red and Leaf Green, and it was compatible with those games. I remember when I read about this in Nintendo Power before it actually came out, I thought it was going to be compatible with any game that used the Game Boy Advance link cable, which was great, because again, I mean, I just kind of complained about how it was too short. So I was really looking forward to that, but I was kind of bummed out when it only worked with ones that were kind of specifically programmed with. And then, again, since that was near the end of the Game Boy Advance life, it wasn't too many of them, but it was still a very cool piece to have. This little thing right here, which you could then plug into the top of your Game Boy Advance, if it ever wants to go in. And just like that, you can face people in Pokemon Red and Leaf Green wirelessly, which was pretty darn cool back then. Of course, that was a feature that then the Nintendo DS would, everything would be wireless. Cords were not a thing any longer, unless I guess you wanted to plug it in to charge it. Next accessory is kind of a link cable, but not really. I mean, kind of a link cable, but not really. That doesn't make any sense. And that is the cable that would allow you to connect your Game Boy Advance to the GameCube. So this is, I mean, I guess it's technically a GameCube accessory, but I mean, you can't use it unless you have a Game Boy Advance. And this would be great for games like Legend of Zelda 4 Swords Adventures, which was really cool. But in order to actually get the most out of that game, you had to have 4 of those link cables and 4 Game Boy Advances, plus the GameCube games. So unfortunately, I don't think many people probably ever had the chance to really experience that, which is sad, because it really is an awesome game. I guess it's kind of just like Triforce Heroes that's out now, but still, I mean, I'll always think that 4 Swords Adventure is definitely kind of the best multiplayer Zelda game. It is just so darn cool. Next up on the accessory list, we have the Game Boy Advance AC adapter set. Now this is kind of neat, because I mean, I went on about how this was, the SP was the first console to kind of use a rechargeable battery, but you could buy this for your Game Boy Advance. This hooks into where you would normally put batteries, and then you could use this AC adapter to charge it up so that you didn't actually have to, use your external, or your, AA batteries. You could just charge the piece that went into the battery slot rather than having to use batteries, which is kind of cool. But then again, that doesn't help me, of course, as I was saying. If you're somewhere and you just want to swap the batteries right there, and you unfortunately don't have a place to plug it in. Also, I showed this earlier, but just in case in the package doesn't make it very clear, this plugs into the top of your Game Boy Advance, and then you have the other end, which plugs into your GameCube. And again, that was also useful for games like Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles, as it notes right on the package, which is pretty cool. And the final, actually that's a lie, that's totally a lie. I have two more accessories to show. This one is actually the only unofficial accessory we're going to look at, but it's just so cool, is the TV tuner for the Game Boy Advance. Look how massive that thing is. I'm actually not going to take it out of the box right now. This is just a pain to get back in there. And unfortunately, they've kind of shut off the airwaves, so you can't listen to, or you can't watch TV wirelessly with an antenna anymore. I also had the tuner for the Turbo Express, which doesn't work anymore, which is a really big shame. But that's kind of a cool thing that used to work for Game Boy Advance, which I'm happy to have. It has a really shiny box too. Everything was silver in the early 2000s. And the final accessory I'm going to show, I'm not going to talk about it too much because I actually did a separate video on this, although I guess it's been like 4 years almost since I did that, is the e-reader, which has kind of come back into the limelight again because of the recent release of Super Mario Advance 4 on the eShop, which includes all of the e-reader levels, which is super cool. Unfortunately, I don't have kind of one in the package to show you, because the e-reader only came in one of those plastic packages that you had to destroy in order to get to it, which really sucks. It didn't have like a nice box in North America, which you could just open and take it out and then preserve the box and put it back on the shelf. What I can show you though is a set that came with the e-reader, but also came with a Game Boy Advance. And there were two versions of this. There was the Glacier one that I just showed you, and there was also a purple one. What actually happened was, it's interesting. For Christmas, my sister always wanted the Game Boy, and this was the year where I also really wanted the e-reader so I could play the new Mario levels. So what happened was, since I already had a Game Boy, my parents bought this, my sister got the purple Game Boy, and I got the e-reader, and it was like the happiest Christmas ever. I was so happy that Christmas to finally be able to play those new Mario levels. It was awesome. But yes, so that is one of the ways in which you could have gotten the e-reader. And for those who haven't seen my other e-reader video, I just want a quick refresher. What happens is you take your e-reader, you put it into your Game Boy Advance, and now you can swipe cards into it. And there were some games, like this one right here, which were kind of releases of NES games like Excite Bike, and this pack would include 5 cards, which you could then swipe into the e-reader, and then you could play Excite Bike on your Game Boy Advance. What you would also have to do sometimes for games like Super Mario Advance 4 is you would have to have a Game Boy Advance with the e-reader, then you would have to have another Game Boy Advance with Mario Advance 4 in it, and then you would have to have a link cable to link this Game Boy Advance to the Game Boy Advance that had Mario Advance 4 in it, and then you could swipe your cards, like this one right here, a level card, in the e-reader, and since it was linked to the Game Boy Advance with Mario Advance 4 in it, it would save the level that is on this card into Mario Advance 4, and it was like the biggest pain ever, and I totally understand why it didn't take off. Because to have 2 Game Boy Advances, a link cable, an e-reader, and the game, and then buy the cards, it was just like the most gigantic hassle. But the cards are so cool, and I will always be happy that I own these cards and can just look at them whenever I want, despite the fact that it is now available on the eShop. In Japan, it's interesting because there were actually 2 versions of the e-reader. The very first version did not have the link port on top of the e-reader, so it was only good for swiping games like Excite Bike here, which were kind of individual games that you could then swipe and play here. Then the e-reader Plus was released in Japan, which had the link port, which then you could use your Super Mario Advance e-reader cards for. Also interestingly in Japan, games like Super Mario Advance 4, unlike in North America where you would just go to the store and buy a complete series of Mario Advance e-reader cards, so like here we had Series 1 and Series 2, in Japan, e-reader cards, like the ones from Mario Advance 4, were actually released in randomized packs, which, as it says on the back here, like this is, I will actually zoom in and show you, because people probably haven't seen these before, and I think they're really fascinating. So for example right here, we have, as it says, Series 1 of Super Mario Advance 4 e-reader cards, and at the bottom there, they cost 191 yen, and as it says, they each can include 5 cards per pack. And if we look at the top here, it says that Series 1 includes 5 cards in total. So instead of just buying the whole series in one shot, you would pay about $2 for one of these packs and get 5 random cards. So in order to get all of the cards from like Series 1 of Mario Advance 4, you would have to buy who knows how many packs, and there is so little information about this online. But it's interesting though just to note how differently the e-reader card system kind of worked in Japan compared to North America, especially considering the fact that they had 2 e-readers, and that just sounds like it would have been the most annoying thing. Thankfully, we only got the one that had the link port, so people didn't, buy it and then have to go out and buy another one. To use the Mario Advance 4 cards later, that would have just been the biggest pain ever. But with that said, I thought maybe this video was going to end up being a little bit shorter than my other one, but I think we're at about half an hour, so I guess it ended up being just about as long, because there's just so much to talk about when it comes to Nintendo portable consoles. And again, I don't even own like all the different variants of the original Game Boy Advance and the SP, so I probably could have gone on for like another 15 minutes if I owned all of those. But with that, that is the Game Boy Advance. All of its kind of different models. Hopefully you learned today, if you did not know already, about that whole brightness thing, because that's really cool. Definitely, if you're looking for an SP, keep an eye out for the AGS 101, which has a better, cooler, brighter, whatever you want to call it, screen compared to the earlier models. But I mean, they're both cool, so pick up whatever you would like. But with that said, I didn't even talk about that, too. I was going to quickly mention how the Game Boy Player is the most awesome thing ever. It lets you play Game Boy Advance games on your TV, and just because this thing alone, the GameCube is one of the most awesome consoles ever released, and Nintendo stinks for not releasing a thing on the Wii U that allows you to play DS games and instead wants you to rebuy them all, despite the fact that they're not even releasing like half of them and they're taking forever, just like we always do with Virtual Console. But that is a rant for another day. So thanks for watching this. I hope you enjoyed seeing all of my crazy Game Boy Advance stuff. We're going to look at some more Nintendo portable stuff in the future, but instead of going forward to the Nintendo DS, I think we're going to take a little bit of a step back and look at my Game & Watch collection, which is located on that shelf right there, because the last time we did that was back in 2012, and my Game & Watch collection has grown a lot in the past 4 years, so I hope you look forward to that. I don't know if that will necessarily be the next video, kind of real-life display video you see from me, but just letting you know that that is coming up in the future. So thanks for watching this, hope you enjoyed, and hope to see you next time for something different. So thanks, and see you later.